Today's episode is brought to you by the Tax Defense Group. Did you know that in order to get your stimulus check, you had to have filed your taxes for the 2018 or 2019 tax year? If you haven't filed yet, there's good news. The Tax Defense Group can rush e-file your taxes. They know that millions of Americans are struggling, and they want to make sure that you get your stimulus check sooner rather than later. Call the Tax Defense Group today at 800-850-7973 to get started. And you can visit them online at thetaxdefensegroup.com. And our other sponsor for today is Writer Junkie. Due to the global pandemic, Writer Junkie is offering their resume writing service for only $100. And with the 3-day turnaround, you can't beat that price and delivery time. Call Writer Junkie today at 805-587-7966, and you can visit them online at writerjunkie.com. Mention that you saw this ad on UCAS Studios, and they'll get right to work. Hi, welcome to TalkSpot. This is Marcus, and today I'm joined by Aubrey de Grey. Aubrey has been on before, and how's it been going? What's going on in your field of work so far? Like, has anything new developed since last time we spoke?
First of all, thank you for having me back. Things are going on all the time. For me, sitting at the coalface of all of this and with constant day-to-day interaction with the scientists at the bench who are actually getting stuff done, it's a great privilege because every week there's some minor breakthrough which, in layman's terms, would be hard to explain why it was a breakthrough at all. But to me, it's clearly a step forward towards the ultimate goal of developing this or that component of the eventual panel of interventions. So, things are going on constantly. And of course, it's not just at the bench. This is true in terms of the wider world. For example, every week or two, some new investor will write to me saying that they have decided they'd like to get into this space. They don't know where to start. Can I help them? And that will be an opportunity for me to connect them with some startup company that is particularly exciting at the moment, things like that. So, there's stuff going on constantly.
So how would you describe your work to someone that hasn't come across it before? Like, what would you say is kind of the goal of your work? And I guess, like, in a practical sense, what are the kind of things that you guys are doing?
Yeah, that's not so hard. That's pretty easy to do, because I do it all the time, of course. The essence of what we do is we are focused on the early stage development of future medicines that will keep people both mentally and physically healthy late in life. In other words, will postpone the physiological decline that we all experience as of now.
Because I know the last time we spoke, you mentioned that you think that there are people that are alive today. I don't want to misquote you, but I believe you said something like along the lines of there are people that are alive today that might live to be several hundred years old or maybe even 1,000 years old. Is that correct? That's something that you believe that can happen, right?
Yes, that's correct. And the reason I believe it, the reason I'm sure it's true, I'm not sure that we're going to get there in time for people alive today, but I think we probably will, and we'll definitely get there eventually, is that the therapies which are going to work will not simply slow down the clock of aging, the physiological decline that we experience. They will actually reverse it. They will actually rejuvenate people and restore them to a state of physical and mental function that is typical of young adults. And that, of course, means that we can do it repeatedly. And, of course, we can do it increasingly well as time goes on and as the therapies become increasingly powerful. So, yes, I think it's highly likely that people who are young today will be able to benefit from these therapies to an extent that will remove any limit on how long they can stay youthful and therefore how long they can stay alive. I don't think it's certain, but I think it's highly likely.
And what are these kind of treatments, I guess? What exactly, how would you describe them?
Yeah, that's pretty easy. So, really, it's all about restoring the microscopic structure of the body, the molecular and cellular structure. So that means, for example, stem cell therapies. If you think about what stem cell therapies are actually doing, the idea here is to put cells into the body that will replace cells that the body is not replacing on its own. So why do you need that? Simply, it's because some types of cell in the body, when they die, they are not automatically replaced by cell division. Most cell types are replaced by cell division, so we don't need stem cell therapy for them. But some of them are not. That's a type of damage repair. So, for example, in Parkinson's disease, there's a type of neuron, a type of brain cell that dies more rapidly than most types of brain cell do, and it eventually end up in a situation where you don't have enough. The people who lose this particular type of cell, a dopaminergic neuron, more rapidly than average, get Parkinson's disease. And the most promising approach to cure Parkinson's disease is to use stem cell therapy to replace those dopaminergic neurons. There are clinical trials going on right now to make that happen.
I don't know. I think for a lot of people, especially like if they haven't necessarily had a relative that has had that or experienced that, I think there's a lot of mystery around that. Like, for example, like Alzheimer's, like you said, Parkinson's. I mean, somebody like me, I mean, I personally don't have any relative that's had that, and I'm fairly young. I mean, I don't really understand what those actually happen. I mean, are those like, yeah, so I mean, I know you just mentioned a little bit about Parkinson's, but what causes something like Alzheimer's? Like, why is it so prevalent in elderly people? I mean, I'm sure there must be some young people that have it, but like, I guess, is that an example of just a disease that's kind of related to people aging, or?
Well, right. So what you're really highlighting with that question is the problem with the word disease, because people have a sense of diseases as something that can be cured and aging as something that's kind of natural and universal and inevitable and so on. And kind of that leads to the assumption that aging is kind of off limits to medicine. And this is a real problem, because aging is definitely not off limits to medicine. The problem is with the terminology. Really, things like Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease should not be called diseases. They should be called parts of aging that we have chosen to give disease-like names to. All of these things, whether we call them diseases or not, if they happen late in life, and they don't often happen early in life, that means that they are caused by having been alive a long time. In other words, they are caused by the progressive and initially asymptomatic accumulation of some kind of change to the composition or structure of some part of the body. So in the case of Parkinson's disease, the change in question is the progressive loss of a particular type of cell. In other cases, it may be the progressive accumulation of waste product inside a type of cell, or it may be the accumulation of molecular crosslinks between proteins that cause a loss of elasticity of a particular tissue, things like that. All of them actually well-defined, clear, concrete phenomena, molecular and cellular changes to the composition and structure of the body. If we can restore those to how they were at an earlier age, or something like how they were at an earlier age, then that is just preventative maintenance. That's exactly the same way that we already successfully maintain vintage cars, for example, way, way beyond how long they were designed to last.
So when it comes to people, like as of like today, I mean, what decade of a person's life do you feel like is, or do you think is, I guess, the most pivotal when it comes from transitioning from being, you know, a physically active person to someone of an old person when the decade is over? So I guess what I'm asking is, you know, for example, when somebody hits their 60s, I mean, do you see a huge difference between the point of someone who's 60 and let's say like 69 than let's say 50 or 59? I mean, is there a decade that right now is kind of the pivotal part of someone's life that kind of takes...
Well, yeah, not really. I mean, the situation, of course, is different for different people. Different people have different rates of aging, and that's why they get sick at different ages. I mean, it's not very different. You know, nobody lasts to 150, and very, very few people exhibit any kind of signs of aging before the age of 50. But still, there's a variation. So really, it's all about paying attention to your body. But the point about these therapies is because they are damage repair, they kind of fit in the sweet spot between prevention and treatment. In other words, they are treatment in the sense that they restore you to how you were at an earlier age, but they're also preventative in the sense that that they are applied typically before you actually get sick.
Do you think that that's a major thing that, like in the U.S., I mean, this the idea of preventative care, is that really just not really practiced well compared to other countries in the world, especially like in this type of field?
Oh, it's not practiced properly anywhere. That is for sure and certain. The fundamental problem is that preventative medicine is a hard sell. That, you know, people in the wider world, they kind of know intuitively that medicine is black magic, and it's new medicines are by definition experimental. And therefore, if you're not yet sick, then your intuitive assessment of the risk-benefit ratio is going to be negative. You're going to think that it's a bad idea to submit to this or that medical intervention because it might do you more harm than good. And we have to educate people out of that mindset. We have to educate people up into the state of thinking that these medicines, even if they haven't been around very long, are actually going to be required in order to keep you healthy later in life. And that as time goes on, it's going to be harder and harder to keep you healthy. And it's harder and harder even to apply medicines that will restore you to good health. That's a hard sell. But step by step, we're getting there. There are already exceptions, of course. Things like statins. So statins clearly are preventative. People take them before they start getting heart disease. But they are popular because the concept that low cholesterol is a way of postponing your risk of atherosclerosis and heart attacks and so on, that concept has permeated the public psyche. We just need to do that again and again and again.
Well, I mean, where do you feel like this, I guess, skepticism that people have of, I suppose, the medical industry or preventative care? I mean, where do you think that that's really come from? Like, is that more of a newer phenomenon, like over something that's happened over the last 20 years or so? Or is this longer than that? Or is it just the idea of the institutions themselves that people have always been skeptical of?
It's as old as medicine itself, and it's reasonable. It's not stupid. So, I mean, the whole idea of first do no harm, this principle that that medical practitioners have to, take an oath about, that arises from this fact, from the fact that it's so easy to do harm with medicine that you have to be really careful. And that has led to people, being overly cautious with regard to what medicine they are willing to submit to. And of course, on the part of the doctors themselves, what medicine they're willing to prescribe or administer. It kind of makes sense. But as time goes on, and as we get more and more knowledgeable about how the body works and how we can manipulate how the body works, in other words, how we can develop medicines, then that principle needs to be modulated. So, right now, it's already being modulated up to a point. People are slightly, as I mentioned, more willing to submit to preventative medicine so long as they have a really, really good safety profile, okay? And that just needs to change a little bit more over time.
Well, no, I think that totally makes sense. And like you said, I mean, I think there is a little bit of a healthy skepticism, but I mean, especially with the work that you're doing now, I mean, this isn't something that someone can just kind of remedy on their own or just do at their own house. So, I mean, the work that you're talking about, I mean, the idea of, reversing aging and, extending your lifespan. I mean, this is something that like medical professionals are going to have to be involved in this whole field, right? I mean, they'll have to, like, I mean, I guess in an ideal world, I guess what I'm asking is like, how will the process look like, let's say in 30 years from now? I mean, will there be like facilities like in, let's say, every major metropolitan city or area? Like, at least let's start like in California or the United States. I mean, would that kind of be where it is, where you would go in like once a month or once a week or a couple times a year, and you would go into one of these facilities? Or how would your work, like once it, I guess, permeates the rest of society, like how would it like practically be, just, I guess, instituted?
I don't think once it gets widely established, I don't think it's going to be particularly exciting. It's going to be just like regular, outpatient kind of stuff, where it's all done with injections, and you get them maybe once every 10 years or something like that. Now, of course, that's in the end. I very much expect that there will be a transitional period when things are tougher and when we need to administer some of these things using surgery. But that will be a brief period, I believe, because, of course, there will be enormous incentive to improve on things that require surgery so that they are less invasive and more available to people who are that much closer to the brink, so to speak.
So let's say, for example, like women that have gone through menopause, I mean, is there a way to, like, I guess, reverse that and like for them to be able to to even potentially get pregnant again, or once that kind of happens, that's it forever?
There's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't reverse menopause. After all, menopause ultimately is caused by a change in the structure of the ovary, namely loss of oocytes, right? Loss of egg cells. So we can totally restore the ovary to a youthful state, or indeed replace it with a whole new ovary, and bang, no menopause, right? So just like replacing the liver or the heart, or repairing them for that matter. Menopause has consequences other than infertility, hormonal changes that cause osteoporosis and so on. So absolutely, it makes sense to repair that too.
So then, with all of these things too, I mean, I guess what would be the like population consequences? So I mean, if you have people that are, living to be, let's just say, for example, 75 years from now, there are people walking around that are, 150 years old, and they look and act like somebody who's 50 years old. I mean, what kind of consequences do you think that would have on the population at large, in the sense of, I mean, are we going to have a population of 20 billion people in 70 years from now, like walking the earth? Or how do you feel like that's going to impact the general population of, certain countries or the planet just in general?
Yeah, people worry about this a lot, of course, and why not? But the fact is, it's not going to be a problem. And the reason we know it's not going to be a problem is simply that we are already fixing it. The problem of overpopulation that exists today is real. It's why we have climate change. But it is a result not of running out of space, but rather of the amount of pollution that the average person generates. And of course, we're fixing it with the advent of other technologies, whether it's renewable energy or artificial meat or, desalination or whatever. And of course, this applies not only to greenhouse gases, it applies to everything else. We've already seen essentially a reversal of the ozone layer problem from decades ago because of the change in the use of refrigerants, so that we don't use CFCs anymore, things like that. And it's going to apply in terms of other types of pollution with bacteria that eat plastics. There are major advances in that all the time. So, really, we're in a position where we are absolutely certain over the next few decades to be reducing the amount of pollution that the average person generates, and therefore the amount of pollution that the humanity as a whole generates, even if we increase the population, the number of people, because the change is just going to be faster than the changes in the number of people. So it's going to be a very, very, very long time, hundreds and hundreds of years for sure, before we really have an overpopulation problem that's even as bad as the one we have today.
Well, even by that point, too, I mean, I imagine that, hopefully within a couple hundred years or so, it'll be, I don't want to sound like Star Trek or something, but hopefully, people will be able to leave the planet and, at least live in settlements, other places. I mean, who knows, I guess.
Yeah, don't go there. The difficulty with that whole idea is that, number one, you can't get to enough space. Think about it. Yes, space is big, but you can only get, 1 light year away in 1 year, even if you go at the speed of light. And if you have an exponential growth in the number of people that exist, you're going to have an increase in the density because it's only a polynomial growth, a cubic growth in the amount of space you can get to in a certain amount of time. In fact, it's much worse than that because you haven't just got to get to enough space, you've also got to have enough matter to build the people out of, not to mention the spaceships and everything, right? And matter is in short supply outside of the solar system. So that's not really an option. The other rather more fundamental and rather more pertinent reason why you shouldn't be talking about mass immigration into space is people don't want to go there. Only a few people go there. So it's not a particularly persuasive approach either. So no, I don't think that's really the right answer. I think that, by the time, hundreds and hundreds of years from now, that we start to have an actual problem of enough space on the planet, because the pollution problem has not been a limiting factor after all, the way it is today, then the situation we're in is one in which we just can't imagine what we're going to be made of. We just don't have, it just makes no sense to try to guess what options would be available to us to give ourselves enough space at that point.
Even if people are living longer, I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to have more children than they were having before. It just means they're going to be living longer. So instead of, like, let's say in this intermediate like period where somebody, let's say that's 45 years old now, like after like getting this treatment, let's say they live to be, in the mid 100s or even like 200. I mean, there's still a very real possibility that if they had 2 kids or they have 2 kids now, that they won't have any more children. I mean, I guess there's no necessarily guarantee that somebody would have more children just because they have the physical ability to do so.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. We have absolutely no idea what people are actually going to do. Right now, people are choosing in rapidly increasing numbers not to have any kids at all. Just because, and indeed, the fact that you mentioned earlier that we won't have menopause anymore actually promotes the reduction in birth rate of the population as a whole, because it gives women the opportunity to postpone having their first child for another decade and another decade. Of course, everywhere in the world right now, when we see this demographic transition of fertility rates plummeting as a result of reaching a certain level of female emancipation and education and so on, simultaneously with the reduction in the number of kids that women have on average, there is an increase in the age at which they have them. That increase is only rather slight right now, but that's because we have menopause.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting points. I mean, if you have, let's say, a very professionally minded woman in the Western world, and she's going for, advanced degree or a really high position in, corporation or something like that. I mean, if she had the ability to push off having children and really focus on her career, I mean, she could potentially wait till she's 50 years old to do it then. And before her even her first kid or even getting married or whatever.
Oh, 150.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting point. So in 100 years from now, if you had I guess this is more of a guess, but what do you think the life expectancy could look like, let's say in the year 2120, I guess?
It becomes impossible to calculate life expectancy in the normal way. So the way people intuitively think of life expectancy is something like, the average age at which people died last year. Or, for example, the average age at which people who are alive this year will die. Now, the second of those numbers obviously is unknowable because it's something about the future, right? And the first of those numbers actually is also not the way that the headline numbers that you see in the papers every year are calculated. What they do instead is they calculate the proportion of people at each age that died last year, and they multiply them up. So essentially they pretend that there are going to be no further improvements in the future. And that's the number they get. It's called period life expectancy. Now, that's literally not going to be we're not going to be able to calculate it anymore, because as soon as we get into this point where we are able to rejuvenate people, we will have such an enormously rapid reduction in the risk of death at any age that most people will be predicted to live longer than anybody has lived so far. So in other words, we won't have the source data. We won't have the proportions available for the years that nobody's lived to yet. And that, it kind of underlines what I always say about life expectancy in the post-aging world, which is it really shouldn't be an issue. It shouldn't be something that you bother thinking about as part of how you decide how to live your life. Right?
Oh, yeah, no, that makes sense. So, I mean, I guess in your research and everything, like when you've looked at people that, let's say, that live to be over 100 years old, I mean, what are some of the common threads that they have? Like, I saw there was the news that there was a piece the other day on, one of the local news stations in LA that said there was a woman celebrating, I think it was her 108th birthday or 111th birthday, or maybe not 111th, that might be a little too old, but yeah, she was celebrating something, like she was definitely over 100 years old. What are some of these common, I guess, things that you'll see in people that live to be over 100 years old? Like, why are those people living to be 100, whereas, the average person, I mean, even though you just said even they calculated up, I mean, let's say the average person in America lives to be, I think for men, I don't know what they say, it's 77 or whatever it is, but what are some of these ways that these people are living longer? I guess, what about them makes them be able to live that old?
Yeah, there is an answer to that. So there are not many things that centenarians have in common. Some of them smoke, some of them are overweight a little bit, things like that. But there's one thing that pretty much all centenarians do have in common, which is nothing bothers them. They don't necessarily have particularly stress-free lives. Well, they have not necessarily had stress-free lives, but whenever they get into a stressful situation, they understand how to cope with it and not actually be stressed out by it. So we understand pretty well why this matters. That basically the result is that you have a diminution of the increase in stress hormones, the hormones that are released by the brain in a stressful situation. We know that those hormones accelerate the accumulation of various types of damage. So it makes sense that people who are good at coping with stressful situations would live longer. But of course, this is all irrelevant to the situation we're talking about today here in this interview, because those people live longer in the absence of these medicines that don't yet exist that we're developing. And the interesting thing is what's going to happen when those medicines do exist.
Okay. No, I can totally see that. I guess in one aspect, too, of your research and all the work that you've done, like, I know that there seems to be something of, I mean, maybe there's just more awareness of it. I'm not sure if there's more awareness or people actually have this more, but, you know, this it seems like there's this rise of like mental health issues, especially amongst younger people, or maybe people in middle age and younger, where you see this rise, it seems like, in depression and anxiety and, you know, experiencing very high levels of stress and things of that nature. Are all of those things physiologically related, or how can somebody, let's say that, I don't know, is 25 years old right now or 20 years old right now, and they suffer from, you know, I don't know, high levels of anxiety to a point where they have to take medication or things of that nature. Is there a way to repair their brains? I mean, this might sound really unscientific the way I'm describing it, but is there a way that a person that is young like that, is there like a treatment that they can have to kind of repair the part of their brain that is, I guess, I don't know, either overactive or underdeveloped? I'm not really sure exactly how these things impact the brain and, you know, what that impact has in the person's, you know, personality traits, I guess, or these diagnoses. But yeah, is there a way, I guess, for somebody to have that part of their brain fixed, I guess, for lack of a better term?
Right. So you're asking a big question there. You know, there's a lot of different questions rolled into one, really, in what you're saying, because different people have a wide variety of different neurological conditions, some of which would not be called conditions because they're too mild, or they just, you know, they're a spectrum within the population. And, you know, the range of methods for addressing such conditions is equally broad. You know, whether it's at the level of just psychiatry and psychology and you know, mental health measures, or whether it's pharmacological, or even in some cases surgical, it has been. So, you know, there's lots of things that we need to take into account when determining whether something can be fixed. And this is just a huge proportion of the whole of medicine. It doesn't relate necessarily to the biology of aging.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. I mean, because it seems like those issues, again, I mean, this is at large. I mean, I haven't read any academic papers about this or anything like that, but it seems like that is more of a youth-related issues. I mean, even feelings of loneliness and things of that nature. I mean, it sounds like the people that are talking about the most, or at least most common articles in the, you know, the media, it sounds like they're mostly talking about young people, which, like you said, it's not really connected to aging, but it would be interesting to see, I mean, especially these younger people as they get older, if these issues will still be as prolific, or if this is just a stage in their life, so to speak. I mean, I don't want to demean it or anything like that, but hopefully it could be a thing where they can overcome it. I guess I'm not entirely sure, but
I honestly don't know whether they really are more prominent. You know, there's always a problem when you look back in history at medical problems with regard to how they were diagnosed, whether they were diagnosed. Alzheimer's is a great example. You know, Alzheimer's wasn't a disease in the past; it was senile dementia. So, if anything, that was a good thing. As I mentioned earlier, it's kind of problematic to call Alzheimer's a disease. But equally, the fact that it is now called a disease has led to it being studied better, so perhaps there's an advantage.
Well, so I guess one last question before we get going, but let's say your average person that lives in, I don't know, Pennsylvania or even in Wales, or just your average person just living their life. I mean, what are some things that they can do now to kind of begin that process? I mean, is there, I mean, I guess, like what, I don't know how to word it other than, what are some practical things that we could do now to kind of, extend our lives?
Well, of course, there really isn't very much. At this point, the main thing to do is live the way your mother told you to, wear a seatbelt and don't get seriously overweight and don't smoke. I mean, it's very boring, but that's really the truth. There's nothing special that we can do today that will substantially make a difference. Of course, there are some people who can benefit substantially from supplements or lifestyle changes and so on, but that's the minority of people who have drawn some particular short straw when it comes to aging, and there's some aspect of damage that's accumulating unusually rapidly in those people. If that's occurring in isolation, then one's rate of aging can be perhaps somewhat normalized by simple measures that simply address that one thing. But for most people, everything's happening more or less in lockstep, and so basically it's all too complicated, and nothing that exists today actually works. So really the only answer to your question, the only thing people can really do to improve their chances of making the cut and benefiting from the therapies that we're developing that don't yet exist, is write me a large check so that I can get it done faster. I wish that were a joke, but unfortunately, as you probably gather, it's not.
So, I mean, are you able to get funding from like governments and things of that nature? Or, I mean, is all the donation or all the money that comes in, is it primarily through private donors?
That's changing. So okay. Until maybe 5 years ago, it was pretty much entirely philanthropic. Of course, some of it comes from a few wealthy people. Some of it comes from a large number of grassroots donations of small amounts. And that's going to continue for a while to be an absolutely essential component of the thing. But the reason it's not the only component now is because some of the research projects that are working towards these therapies actually exist now. Those projects have moved far enough along in terms of proof of concept that investors, people who actually don't just want to see this thing happen, but they actually want to make money out of it, they feel that there's been sufficient de-risking that they can sensibly actually make an investment. So we at SENS Research Foundation, we're a non-profit, a 501c3 public charity, but we have spun out half a dozen of our projects over the past few years as startup companies, which have been able to attract considerably greater numbers of dollars than what we were able to provide philanthropically. You did also mention government funding. That's important, and certainly at the moment there's still a shortfall there. Government funding is still very much restricted to the more unambitious, baby step kind of approaches that we think are just not the right way to go. And it's very difficult to get government funding for the sort of work that we do. But that's fine. It'll come.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, because your operation, it's primarily in the United States, or is it in other countries as well?
Our operation is primarily in the United States. We do fund one or two labs outside of the U.S., but most of our funded labs are inside the U.S., and of course our own lab is in California. Okay. But our donations come from worldwide.
Yeah, it seems like with the U.S., I don't know. Every time it seems like the medical industry is mentioned in the news, and just funding and everything like that. It just sounds like a total mess. Like where money's allocated and who's connected to which thing. And I guess I'm sure it's probably not all that bad, but I don't know. It just every time I ever hear this conversation talked about or mentioned or whatever, it just I don't know, it just makes me very, I guess, unhappy with the way that the organization or how everything is run in the United States when it comes to what's funded, what's not funded, and who's connected to where the funding is going. But hopefully you guys will be able to get, Yeah, hopefully the funds will continue to come in. And I know right now, I mean, during this whole pandemic, I mean, I'm sure that's probably definitely put a wrench in your guys' plans. I mean, just like it has with everyone else. But hopefully it hasn't set you guys back too far. But yeah. So how can we keep up with the kind of information that you guys have coming out? I mean, do you post articles or white pages, or do you have social media accounts that people can kind of follow the work that you're doing and just kind of information that you're producing?
Totally, we do. I mean, the right place to start is simply to go to our own website, sense.org. But there are certainly links there to all of our social media presence on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and so on. But you don't really need to go to those if you're already at our website, because it's all there. And that is written for everybody, for the expert community right through to the complete novice, both at the level of what science we're doing and at the level of what advocacy and what future we're doing and what other people are doing that we feel is important contributions to the same mission. It's all there.
Yeah, I've actually checked out the site, and I was able to understand it. When I looked at it before, I was worried that, oh man, this is going to sound like I need a doctoral degree to understand anything that's being written, and that wasn't the case at all. I mean, you're right. It seemed like an average, a normal person could totally read it and they would understand what's being said, and it's not just a bunch of, scientific mumbo jumbo, for lack of a better term, for lay people. But well, definitely. Well, Dr. Grey, thank you so much for coming on again. I'm excited for your work. I mean, I'd like to live longer than I would less time, so hopefully, your work will continue to develop, and yeah, I'm excited for it. I think everyone should be excited for it, to be honest. I mean, I think reasonable people should have no reason to not want to live longer, so.
Well, that's absolutely right. And thank you again for having me on the show.
All right, well, take care. Have a good rest of your day. We want to thank today's sponsors again, the Tax Defense Group and Writer Junkie. You can contact the Tax Defense Group at 800-850-7973. And Writer Junkie's phone number again was 805-587-7966.